Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the right's fight over AI chips, the return of the Department of War, and how the Republicans embraced Believe Women. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Trump, has been widely credited by people, including myself, for changing not only the right's orientation toward China, but that of the American elite more generally, encouraging a hawkish stance that I think happily has seen as much economic as military expression. And one of the clear and recent expressions of this new hawkishness on the right especially is a bill by Senator Jim Banks to restrict the sale of NVIDIA's most advanced AI chips to China. The idea is a simple one. If we have great technology, we don't want to give it to the Chinese. They have a long history of very successfully imitating, adapting, and then improving on technology that we send to them. But a lot of people on the right don't love this idea. The tech right, notably including David Sachs, White House advisor, host of the All In podcast, have been attacking any opposition to AI sales as doomerism, AI doomerism, a kind of unthinking and inhuman philosophy that fails to see the benefits that will accrue to us and to all humanity by sending them our finest chips. Geoff, I think it's safe to say, the resident expert on the tech right. How do you understand this debate?
It is very interesting to see this framed in terms of doomerism versus accelerationism. And clearly, on one level, this relates to the whole reason that many of these figures, Sachs is a longtime Republican, although he's donated to Democrats over the years. But I think, he wrote actually an interesting book in 1995 with Peter Thiel about multiculturalism on campus. So he's really been a kind of conservative within the tech world since the early years, and he was involved in the founding of PayPal and so on, and has been aligned with Thiel and other conservatives within Silicon Valley. Nonetheless, the larger kind of realignment of tech with Republicans over the past couple of years is really closely tied to the Biden administration's attempts to regulate and restrict various aspects of the industry, one of them being crypto, one of them being AI. Those are probably the most important ones. And so this really kind of brings together a whole range of issues. One is the concern that AI is going to somehow bring about, and this is the doomer allegation, right? That it's going to bring about this kind of Terminator future of Skynet taking over and attempting to annihilate humanity. And this is a real current of thought within Silicon Valley, entertained by a lot of quite powerful and influential people. So there's sort of that current of the debate. And what's interesting is it's clear that some version of that did influence people in the Biden administration and these kind of regulatory efforts. But then there's another kind of connected but not entirely overlapping current of concern, which really just has to do with its military uses. And this too fed into the Biden administration's approach. Under Biden, there were several measures taken to limit the export of advanced chips to China. These export controls imposed in 2022 and 2023 were quite significant. and unprecedented. And of course, many in the industry, especially chip makers like NVIDIA, were obviously unhappy about this. And so, they in aligning themselves to some extent with the Republicans and attempting to, sort of charm Trump by, the CEO of NVIDIA having dinner at Mar-a-Lago recently, that they have really been trying to undo the various restrictions and limitations that were imposed by the Biden administration. But the point about doomerism is that there's also a kind of national security dimension to that, which we could put in terms of, and this is something that some people in the Biden administration explicitly said, that we have to think of AI as basically the 21st century equivalent of nuclear weapons, because of its immense power. And so, of course, the U.S. isn't going to just hand over its nuclear technology to the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War. So, for the same reason, we're not going to allow, and indeed, there was some discussion in the Biden administration that, essentially we need to just allow a couple of large tech monopolies to dominate AI research and development, and those need to be closely aligned with the state, and that they need to be kind of coordinated with state efforts. And so, it's like there are these kind of two currents, one of which has to do with a sort of national set of national security concerns, the other of which has to do with this kind of philosophical narrative about the inevitability of some kind of AI apocalypse. And that, many people like Sam Altman and Elon Musk, who are involved in the development of AI, do think, well, you have to approach it in a certain way or else this apocalypse is inevitable. So the doomerism charge, I think, though, is a way of distracting from the national security. In this case, when people like Sachs, charge people who want to limit AI chip sales to China of doomerism, what they're really doing is trying to divert from the national security dimension of the debate, which I think does kind of create a certain set of issues for the tech right specifically, because on one hand, their interests are aligned with companies that are, multinational corporations that want to reach large international markets. And then on the other hand, they want to present themselves as aligned with, for strategic reasons, as aligned with Trump's sort of America First approach. And so it does seem like there's a deeper issue here that just has to do with Silicon Valley starting in the 1990s, having been, previously an industry closely tied to the Cold War national security apparatus, having, been really built up in all sorts of ways by government contracts, state subsidies. In the 1990s, the guiding ethos of the industry became extremely both globalist and individualist. It on one hand sort of celebrated the global reach and nature of the new technologies, particularly new communications technologies, and the way that they were, essentially abolishing the borders of the nation state. And this was deeply embedded in the outlook. And at the same time that they were, about, new means of individual expression and individuals connecting with other individuals without having to go through the various kinds of mediating institutions that would have been needed to build those connections previously. And so I think what you see now is, for various reasons, a sort of awkward return to something like the first dispensation of Silicon Valley, which was really, again, closely aligned with the national security state during the Cold War, but that there are deep kind of conflicts both with the business model and with the philosophy of the industry as it developed over the past several decades. And so, I think that the whole I generally see the whole kind of accelerationist doomerist debate as a bit of a diversion on all kinds of levels. I mean, I think these people do really believe in the stakes of that debate, but on some level, it's a useful way of kind of distracting from more immediate issues of power that exist today. Of what's the relationship between this industry and the state? What's its alignment or lack thereof with the interests of the nation state? To what extent should the power of these companies be constrained by their belonging to a particular nation on some level? Like these are very difficult questions that, again, the kind of dominant ideology of the industry found various ways to kind of avoid for several decades. And I think that the doomer versus accelerationist debate tends to be all projected onto this future in which we have this super intelligent AI. And the question is, what's the power relation between humanity and the super intelligent AI? Is it under our control? Are we under its control? But this essentially exists in the realm of fantasy. Like it's a sci-fi narrative, and it is a useful way of not talking about the things that are actually pressing concerns for the industry today. And so I think it's a good illustration of how this doomer versus accelerationist discourse serves as a diversion that allows for the avoidance of like these much more immediate existential questions. And my overall take is that the industry is kind of lurching in various ways back to something much closer to its status in the mid to late 20th century, prior to the 1990s, when it was really an appendage of the national security state. And it was reliant on contracts from it, and this never ceased to be the case entirely. State contracts and state subsidies were hugely significant, of course, to the rise of Elon Musk, and various other entities as well were involved in this. If we recall the Snowden revelations, the big tech monopolies were all deeply embedded with the national security state in all kinds of ways. But there was a kind of way of avoiding that, the acknowledgement of that. And so I think what you see is a kind of alignment back towards a more explicit and overt embeddedness in the national security state. But then this creates all kinds of concerns, both on a philosophical level, and you see, just a final point, you see a version of a kind of older pro-globalization position slightly tweaked or reframed when the argument is sort of, well, we need to sell these chips to China because then they're dependent on us. And so essentially, we can pursue national security precisely, or we can pursue American interests precisely by globalizing the market for these products, because that will reinforce America's dominant position. And so that is a kind of globalization era type of argument where this is not a zero sum competition between these two countries, but rather we can pursue American interests and also precisely by selling them our products. And so I think we're sort of seeing the birth pangs of a new dispensation, which again I would argue kind of returns us to something closer to the original version of Silicon Valley that really came out of the Cold War. But there are all kinds of deep conflicts that's raising, and that will be difficult to resolve, again, both ideologically and in terms of the business interests of these companies. And I generally see the kind of doomer, the attempt to frame this in terms of, if you don't want to sell China these chips, you're just a doomer. Like, this is just an obvious kind of diversion from the real issues that are at stake, which, again, as I said, is how I see the kind of AI doomer discourse functioning more broadly. It's a way of kind of taking real issues and transposing them onto this speculative sci-fi framework that doesn't really clarify anything.
Yeah, it's you obviously know way more about this than I do, but I'm wondering, to what extent can the government even I mean, governments by their nature operate at a national level. That's where governing is, but capital is international. If there is a profit to be made by selling to China, even if you ask them nicely not to, even if you ban them, there's still, and that there's evidence that they were doing that even when you put in place policies to protect national interests, capital just tries to get around them. Like these companies just try to get around them constantly. So I don't know to what extent they even can. And it's weird to turn this, as you say, into this kind of doomer debate. It's like the response. This must be some kind of PR tactic where you respond to the argument that you wish you were having, as opposed to the actual argument. She's like, "Oh, we'll just frame this as these people are just doomers. That's much easier. Let's have this sci-fi argument about like the Terminator, as opposed to the sort of basic argument about like profit motives. That's just clearly it. There's another interesting aspect to this story, which is there's two weird flows happening here, two contradictory developments in terms of state holdings. Because you've got, so we just went through this whole cycle of like Doge and cutting government spending and selling off the government as much as you can, and this is just a very basic way of kind of trying desperately to raise profits by selling off whatever the government has. But this is after decades and decades of neoliberalism, where this is essentially what they've been doing, we talked about this before, turning the state into a regulatory state. So there wasn't a huge amount to go out, but then a few weeks ago, and I feel like this was a little quiet. Maybe it was a little quiet because I'm in Europe. Maybe you've heard this, but the government the Trump administration quietly took a 10% stake in Intel, which seems to be an opposite movement of taking things, an area of the economy in which the United States is heavily, heavily invested back under the government umbrella. And I am just curious. I don't have a good answer to this. I've just noticed this happening. And I'm wondering if it's, we had an article by Phil Cunliffe in Compact a couple of days ago where he's talking about Serbia. And you might not care about Serbia, but there's the analysis is great because it really talks about our particular moment. When you had the fall of the Berlin Wall and you had all of these like color revolutions, what happens after the revolution is obvious. Liberal capitalism, consumer capitalism. Okay, now if stuff hits the fan, what happens now? And it seems to me there's a lot of talk about the very bad state of a lot of Western economies. There was a discussion today in the UK about the possibility of like not even an IMF bailout being able to save the UK. Comparisons between the US and the USSR in the final stages. And I'm wondering what comes next. And it seems to me there are these quiet moves toward bringing more state ownership in, which could be just the same basic thing that happened during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which was that you take things that are going to fail or are failing under the US, you publicize the debts, and then you privatize the gains whenever they eventually happen. So you sell it off, cheaply. But I'm just curious if that is indicative. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here. I'm just curious if that is indicative of something really scary on the horizon. I mean, we talked last week about the possibility of a AI bust, like the .com bust. Does the government know something we don't know? Are they making moves now to shore themselves or shore companies even up against something? I don't know. But I find that interesting that we've just had this huge fire sale, and now all of a sudden the government sort of moved quietly to take a stake in Intel, and also some of the profits.
And
that's different.
And also in NVIDIA. I mean, this was, the deal that was cut after the Mar-a-Lago meeting between the CEO and Trump was that the U.S. would take a stake in profits from NVIDIA in return for allowing them to sell chips to China. So I guess part of how I would see this is, I hate to bring up COVID, which seems irrelevant here, but to me, the really one of the really significant points about COVID was that it was the first time that a Chinese mode of governance was taken as the model for the entire world. And so, you had China do something and the rest of the world look at it in awe, and everyone try to emulate that. And I think you could argue more broadly that's kind of part of what's going on. Everyone's looking at China and saying, well, it seems to be a form of state capitalism that's working pretty well. And so we need to do something along those lines. And, I think you can see Trump taking a stake in in these companies as a sort of version of that. It just seems to me that overall, what, as you said, nobody quite knows what, if we reach a crisis, like what's the thing that's going to replace the current mode. And it seems to me everybody is, to some extent, or not absolutely everybody, but many powerful countries are in different ways looking to China and saying, well, they seem to have something that works pretty well, so we need to emulate at least some aspects of that.
The Department of War has returned. I remember being surprised as a child when my grandmother talked to me about how she took a civil service exam during World War II and was assigned to a clerical role at the Department of War in Washington, D.C. And I thought the War Department, what is that? So Trump does not have power to change the name of a department single-handedly. That has to be done by an act of Congress. So the true or official name remains the Department of Defense. We can assure everyone. But he's added the War Department as a secondary official name, and Pete Hegseth can now claim as a kind of secondary title, Secretary of War. There's been a fair amount of mockery of Trump over this. He ran as a peace candidate, was touted as an anti-war candidate. He continues to campaign for a Nobel Peace Prize. He sees no contradiction here. He says, look, I'm bringing peace by being very strong. So he thinks it all adds up perfectly with no remainder. What do you make of it?
Well, he sees no contradiction because perhaps there isn't one. Geoff, you have to save me here because, and Matt, you have to save
Ashley,
me.
the hardcore Trumpist.
I do not have. I have such a banal take on this. I apologize in advance. So my first thought was, oh wow, Department of War. How on brand for Trump to say the quiet part out loud. Like we all knew that the Department of Defense was really the Department of War. That it was always a sort of Orwellian stuff, and he's like, oh well, we'll just call it Department of War. But maybe it is actually remaining within the Orwellian vein, that the Department of War actually is the Department of Peace. And by calling it the Department of War, perhaps that's what it is. And he seems to be using it to declare war on random things, which has long been criticized for decades within social policy and social problems literatures, like declaring war on drugs, war on this. It's just a rhetorical flourish and doesn't really do anything to solve any problems. In that sense, Department of War really means the Department of Peace. But on the other hand, some things that I found interesting was that Trump also has an annoying tendency. So I've given that point of view, right? But now let's complicate it because I'm not quite sure. I don't know what he's up to, as usual. But Trump has this annoying tendency, as with many people on the right, to take things at face value. So he said of this, oh, Department of Defense, that's woke. That seems so passive, right? And I'm like, did you never take a sociology class? Like, did you never listen to a punk rock song? Did you ever listen to the news at some point in your life and know that that's just the most basic critique of the United States, that the Department of Defense is really the Department of War, that when they say peacekeeping, that's their euphemism for starting fights with, that's how they do war now, is through the opposite. But he's like, oh, that's woke. They weren't doing war, so let's do war. So they just take everything at face value and don't realize that he thinks that he's the first person in the world to discover branding. All of that stuff was a branding exercise. Obviously, everybody knows that. It was an open secret. And that was part of the reason why Trump was so powerful, because everybody knew when someone like Joe Biden, when officials stood up and talked and said pleasant things, they meant the exact opposite. That's why Trump was so refreshing, because he seemed to say what he meant. That's why Department of War sounds refreshing, because it seems to say what it means. But is it? Does he mean it? Is it the opposite? I don't know. I'm not sure. So that's my extremely banal take. Geoff, Matthew, what do you think?
Trump cited, I think you really hit on the kind of heart of this. Trump cited the fact that the U.S. isn't winning wars anymore as one reason for this change. So it's a rebranding effort. It's a kind of effort to conjure a reality just through slapping a different name on something. And I mean, will that actually transform our military into the world's most lethal fighting force? Which I think is Hegseth's refrain. It'll take more than that, right?
Yeah, I like Ashley's points about declaring war on this, that, and the other thing: drugs, terror, cancer, whatever. So there's a way that you can. I mean, and there's perhaps a kind of paradox here, right? Which is that we, as in, the United States as the kind of global empire, rebranded the Department of War as the Department of Defense. So we didn't want to call war. We wanted to call it defense, but then we wanted to call everything else war. So like all the things that weren't war became war, whereas war became something other than war. War became peacekeeping. So, there's some kind of paradox here. And I think the paradox is heightened by the fact that, the most notable sort of action in military terms over the past week or two was this sinking of a boat alleged to be carrying drug traffickers, and so killing 11 people or so. This struck me as quite a sort of absurd and abhorrent act. But leaving that aside, there are a few things to say about it. One is the thing that really catches my attention at the moment is that, it was striking, almost 10 years ago when Trump, as Republican candidate, denounced George W. Bush's wars, and particularly invasion of Iraq, as a debacle, and, nonetheless managed to win the Republican primary, despite people thinking that this would, Republican voters are patriotic and believe in the military. No, I mean, it turned out that people were that there was a great demand for dissent on this issue. And so now that's become the kind of standard Republican position. Everybody thinks George W. Bush's wars were bad. But as far as I can tell, the entire approach to particularly supposed approach to the cartels, which is bizarrely focused on Venezuela, which is not known as a particularly significant country for drug trafficking, and thus has become a kind of conduit for. You could argue it resembles Iraq, that you had these, which was not a particularly significant country for terrorism, which was the concern after 9/11, but you had these ideological forces in Washington that were obsessed with taking down Saddam, and so they managed to make the war on terror about Saddam. Similarly, there's kind of this vague desire to do something about the cartels, and that conveniently can be turned by various people in Washington who are obsessed with taking down Maduro in Venezuela into a pretext for aggressive military action against Venezuela. So it's a really bizarre kind of case of history repeating itself, and I think it shows that the continuity with prior Republican foreign policy is very real, despite Trump's many sort of heresies and dissents from what seemed to be the consensus at various points in his career. There are still efforts to really revive the war on terror. And, we see this in the designation of cartels as terrorist organizations, which, essentially is becomes a pretext for this kind of military, expansion of the kind of militarized response to it. And of course, none of this is new. I mean, the war on drugs involved a kind of declaration of war against the cartels with a great deal of kind of military action in places like Colombia for decades. So there really is just a kind of way that this might seem like a discontinuity where, this sort of post-Cold War model of unipolarity, which is propped up by this kind of peacekeeping ideology, and which we could see embodied in the Department of Defense, is being overturned by this much more kind of mask off and rhetorically distinctive approach. But I think there are also just many continuities here as far as the endless forever wars on all kinds of things that aren't really or shouldn't really be the objects of declarations of war, and the expansion of military action against supposed cartels. And so I think there's a lot that's disturbingly continuous with some of the worst currents of recent U.S. foreign policy here.
As Epstein has dominated headlines, the right, which long critiqued the idea of believing women in relation to Me Too, has, I guess, at least in certain quarters, taken up the idea, even as the Trump administration downplays the Epstein rumors that many of its members once promoted. Geoff, which women are we supposed to believe now, and who's believing them?
Well, the real leader on this front seems to be Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who, as I understand it, her career in the public eye began when she was the first woman to attend the Citadel. So a feminist pioneer in her time. More recently, she came back in the public eye for being extremely outspoken against the first trans member of Congress, who is a representative from Delaware, using the women's bathroom, and so she managed to get a lot of attention on this front. But Matthew, you may be able to fill in more details from her career, but it did strike me that she's positioned herself as a kind of moral authority on particularly the Epstein controversy that's dividing the right, because she describes herself as a survivor of sexual assault and someone suffering from all kinds of PTSD and related effects of that. And so she attended this hearing with survivors, or self-proclaimed survivors or victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And then the thing that struck me was, she was photographed leaving this event in tears. And this, led to a great deal of coverage. But, what struck me was the echo of a famous scene in which AOC was photographed outside of sorry, I'm lacking the word here, a sort of confinement center for children who had crossed, child migrants in near the border in Texas sometime in the first Trump term. And so this was, these photos of AOC weeping were often, were very memeified by kind of right-wing accounts as like the epitome of the sort of performatively weepy, self-dramatizing left and its sort of use of sort of manipulative use of emotion, of sort of displays of emotion, and implicitly kind of feminized emotion to kind of morally grandstand. And so it strikes me that Mace has in various ways embodied this position, and has it really struck me the obvious echoes of Me Too. And this isn't the first time. There have been other things she said since she came into Congress. Has made various accusations and claims about her own prior traumas that have kind of echoed various things that again were associated with this this moment of kind of left-wing hegemony through this kind of performatively weepy, again, kind of, was often described as sort of emotionally manipulative public posturing. And so it just does strike me, as something I've been tracking, are the kind of echoes of the awakening in the era of sort of anti-awakening. And so this struck me as a clear instance of that and caught my attention for that reason.
Man, you took the words right out of my mouth. It was very much this kind of, it had like that leftish kind of tinge to it, like Me Too, believe women, who will stand up for us? I was triggered. I don't think she used the word triggered, did she? But basically, like, oh, there was discussion of an elevator and that brought up my phobia, and then I'm a survivor, and it was blah blah. It was just so much the sort of like leftish Me Too kind of era. I mean, to a certain extent, she plays against type, and that seems to be her strategy, is to, whatever it is, to jump on the bandwagon that is unpopular but secretly popular. That's what she seems to do. So for a Republican to say these things, maybe it comes off as authentic or something like that, is what she's trying to do. But I would also like to say that actually, and this was what I said in my first book, which I started writing in 2008, and I was right then, and I'm still right now, which is that therapy culture and all this public weepiness was never left wing. It was never left wing. She's actually right at home. All this stuff, like all the awakening on the right, it's just coming home. And this was always going to be an issue because, as I wrote for Compact, they were always responding to, just as I said a moment ago, that Trump responds and takes things at face value. Leftists sounded like, oh, in America, you call them liberals, right? You say, oh, you're a lib, this sort of thing. And so they thought that was liberalism. And so they would go against it and be anti-liberal. And they didn't realize that the left for such a long time had been anti-liberal, that they had been the left version of what had been the old right, the left side of what had been the right of the political spectrum, which was this obsession with identity and getting in touch with feelings as opposed to the cold rationality of liberal modernity and all of this stuff. That's all right wing. And the fact that it got coded left was a symptom of the collapse of the left. And I think a lot of people on the right do not realize that. And if they hated wokeness and they hated the performative emotion, then they should recognize that they're not really on the right. They themselves were always liberals in the classical sense. And they should fight for them. Why is that weepiness destructive of the subject? Why is that anti-liberal? Because you're not supposed to take that into the public sphere. In the public sphere is the realm of rationality. By bringing all that emotion into the public sphere, you are destroying that as a place of reason and turning it into this me and my emotion, which is incommensurable, right? Like my emotions are different than your emotions. And you can't, this is my truth and this is my pain. And if you question that, you're like a really bad person. It just works so well rhetorically, but it is politically empty because reason, it doesn't matter who you are, what genitals you have, whatever. I'm going to say, this is what I think is happening. And you're going to be like, no, I don't think that's happening. Or we can have some sort of we can argue. We can have some objective standard of truth. And I can say, you, dear human being, who is just the same as I am in my brain, if I explain things, you too will come to the same conclusion as me. That is profoundly modern and liberal and political and public. And all this stuff about like, oh, my truth and my trauma and da da da. This is private, doesn't belong in the public sphere because it's incommensurable. It's what we can't have a conversation on that basis because you were just talking about feelings. So this was always a destructive and powerfully anti-modern and conservative idea that made its way onto the left after the left utterly collapsed. So I think that makes sense of kind of why she's actually at home here in this emotive display. And if you don't like that, perhaps give classical liberalism a try. Maybe you're not actually on the right. Maybe you're a classical liberal, and that's okay. That's good.
One thing that's fun about Mace is that she started as a moderate congresswoman, had that perception, and she has made noises about that, continuing through her career. But she's also kind of confounded expectations by moving in an increasingly Trumpian direction. And I think her trajectory kind of toward Trump from a more moderate position, being someone who wanted to speak up for, say, access to contraceptives and opposing any Republican effort to restrict them, does speak to the moderate nature of the Trump phenomenon within conservatism, the fact that it dissents from kind of a strict economic conservative, a strict conservatism, a strict religious conservatism, or social conservatism. So Mace, with her kind of weird hysteria, her kind of ability to pick up on popular opinion and its kind of subterranean shifts, I think is the kind of face of a kind of moderate Republican Party, the moderate Republican Party we're actually going to get. It's not this Nelson Rockefeller, blue blood, high-minded Northeastern WASP construction, right? It's a strange sort of moderation that's disembedded from those old line institutions. With that, thank you, Geoff. Thanks, Ashley. For more, please go to compactmag.com/subscribe and support our work, support the writing of my colleagues, and read everything we publish.